Hello, my name's Edward Lee, and I wanted to go ahead and present my signature presentation for EDUU 607. So I'm a math teacher, and what I was wondering if curriculum in different countries is different than our own, and how does this affect the math achievement within in that country. I found a few things as I went along. But first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the countries that I choose to compare the United States with. So the first country that I went to was was Japan, and one of the reasons why I went to Japan is because it was one of the highest performing in the top 5 PISA rankings for the majority of the entire PISA test. That was for years and years until 2015, when it became ranked a little bit lower, and then this year it was ranked 15th, just below the United States. So a little bit about Japan. Japan has over 126 million people, and it has a negative birth rate. It is a very old country. The country is actually the oldest country, with over 1/4 of its country being over 65 years old. So what's happening is they have a very old population, and the second thing to kind of note is they are the second highest suicide rate out of any country outside of Hungary. With that, what's happened with it is the young people are overworked in their day-to-day. In Japan, they have a sense of they really need to work hard and show their worth and prove themselves. And as a result, what happens is they go to school all day long, they study for tests all day long, and sometimes they don't get home till well after dinner time from studying. One of the biggest sectors there is their private tutoring sectors. That's the one private kind of sector in Japan having to do with education. The rest of it is generally private school, unless if they're going to a religious school. Then they might have a private school as a result. Or if they're international and speak English, they might be going to that as well. So with Japan, they are fairly monocultural, with 98.5% of its population being of Japanese descent. And this is starting to change because Japan has noticed that with their very high suicide rate, with their old population and their negative birth rate, that they're having issues with having a steady workforce of people that are coming in to support their members who are over 65. So what's starting to happen is they're starting to give out work permits for people outside, or green cards, as you will, so that they can get more people into their country. Now, as for them taking up residence, I'm not sure about that at this point. They've been one of those countries, if you're not Japanese, they really don't want you owning land there. But that might change soon with how things are going so far. In school, one of the things I found was interesting is it's compulsory from 6 to 16. That is from primary through lower secondary school. And then what's interesting about it is, since they're so highly motivated and so into education in Japan, 98.8% of students still go on to upper secondary school. And then when they're there in upper secondary school, they'll spend the full 3 years they're in upper secondary school actually studying for university entrance exams. So that way they can actually get into a university. It's very highly competitive there. The next country that I went to is Finland, and I picked it for one of the same reasons. It was really highly ranked. It was actually number 1 for the majority of the tenure of PISA since it started. And just recently, in 2015, they were placed 12th, and this year they're 7th. So they're starting to improve, but they did fall quite a bit. Finland has a very small population compared to Japan. Japan has 126 million people, where Finland has 5 million people, 5.5. And its birth rate is actually approaching 0. So the deaths and the births are about the same. So the birth rate's approaching 0. So they're also fairly monocultural, with 92.7% of its population being Finnish. And then the majority of the immigrants in the country are white. So they're, in terms of race, they're very, very, they're not as diverse in terms of race as other countries might be. So in Finland, school is compulsory from 6 to 18, but what they have is they have two tracks. When you turn 16, you can either go into senior secondary school, which is something where you're trying to prepare yourself to go to a university and get a more high-skilled job, or you go into the vocational track and you learn a vocation or a trade. The government will pay for the vocational track, and 40% of their students in the lower secondary schools actually go on to that vocational track, which I thought was interesting because in Japan they have a similar option where the government will pay part of their vocational track, but only about 1% of the students in Japan actually go off into the vocational track as opposed to going to the upper secondary. So that's one kind of interesting thing to know. My thesis statement was this comparative research analysis compares the similarities and differences in terms of curriculum and achievement in mathematics in Japan, Finland, and the United States. So I want to see what the links are between curriculum and achievement and how that is different between Japan, Finland, and the United States. So a couple of the key pieces of research that I picked up, these are two. One's about from Japan and one is from Finland. I thought I'd just talk about two of the key pieces that I saw. So in this one, it suggests that Finland's high scores on the PISA are due to a lack of high-stakes testing. Finnish students do not take national standardized high-stake tests until they get to secondary school, and only then if they're going into higher education where they're going to take something like the SAT. And instead, their majority of assessment is used to improve learning and is encouraging and supportive by nature. So one of the key things about Finland and what they do differently than Japan and the United States is when they give a test, it's not about a grade. Kids aren't asking what grades they get when they get these tests back. They are looking at it and asking themselves, how do they get better? And that's something that's ingrained in the Finnish society. They really, really want to understand where the mistakes are, and there is a big push in education there to focus on how to get better, how to improve, and instead of, oh, I did not get a good enough grade, I'm going to feel bad about myself. It's how do I get better, what things can I do, and then they hold the belief that if they have enough time in math, that they can actually learn the math and do the math. If they don't have enough time, they might feel that otherwise, but they generally will say that they can do the math if they have enough time. In terms of Japan, the results from the trends in the International Math and Science Study TIMSS in 1999 indicated that Japanese students who expressed positive attitudes towards mathematics were more likely to earn high achievement test scores. So along with this, I found a couple other articles that talked about student affect and student belief that they can do the math, self-efficacy. And there is a strong correlation between self-efficacy and achievement. If students generally believe that they can do it, then what happens is they do better. If they don't have that belief, they generally will give up. And then they will not try to succeed, where if they do think they can get there, they put their time, they put their effort into it, and they generally do get there, or at least somewhere of the sort. As for my key findings, so I had a couple of different things in this juxtaposition section. So one of the things about curriculum, each country has adopted a very similar set of standards. Japan and Finland were very early adopters in the early 1990s. In the United States, what I found was interesting is in the 70s and 80s, they had this open classroom policy where students were able to choose which classes they wanted to, and it was supposed to help low-income, impoverished students and minority groups being able to pick what they like so that way they would do better in those subjects. But what happened is, after a few years, only 40% of the student body was taking math. So it took a little while for the United States to catch up, and in 2010 with the Common Core state standards, they adopted this, but I put 2013 because the states didn't actually adopt it in 2010. It had a very, very poor showing when it first came out. It was not done well from all the studies that I read and all the articles that I read. But what happened is in 2013, California and most of the other states, 45 of them, actually adopted the Common Core state standards when there was an incentive to do so. And as a result, they've all started to do this. And what we've seen is an uptick in their PISA scores over time. The United States went from 38th to 13th place this last year. That's a considerable jump for any state or any country to actually have. Finland has little oversight on the day-to-day going on in the classroom. So in Finland, they hold the belief that if they educate their teachers well enough and they give them the right formula, then what happens is the teachers are going to do what's best by their students. They're going to understand what's going on in the classroom. And the Finnish government takes a very kind of lax stance and just provides the teachers with a curriculum, a set of standards, a framework, and says, you go ahead. They don't come into the classroom, say you need to give a final. They don't go into the classroom and say you're going to have this standardized test, and then you have to end up spending 2-3 weeks out of your school year studying for tests and trying to learn how to take this test, as opposed to we're just going to do math and learn the conceptual understanding behind it. And that's one of the issues that in the United States and Japan they have. We have these constant standardized tests and mandated district finals, and it's for admin, people like that, to show generally that things are working out. I do understand that it does show trends, and you can read a lot from it, but with it, if you have to give all of these things and you have to spend a week studying for the first semester final, a week studying for the second semester final, then you have the CASP because you have juniors where you have to have a 20-day plan where you're studying for the CASP. You have certain kids, you have juniors in high school that are spending 30, 40 days studying for tests, not even including the SAT and the ACT. And it takes a lot away from the actual material that you're teaching in your class towards taking these standardized tests. With this, students' self-efficacy in mathematics makes a huge difference in results. In Japan and Finland, their students generally believe that if they have enough time, then they can do the math. And I found this from a few studies, where in the United States, that is not the case. In the United States, generally, kids who do not think that they could do the math, they don't do very well. It's the same sort of thing. In general, in Japan and Finland, they're encouraged to do well. They're supported in it. In the United States, you'll have classes where, in my experience, you do have a lot of those issues sometimes where you get a set of students who really don't believe that they could do math, and you'll spend the first 4 to 6 months just telling them yes that they can, and then even then you'll only get 5 or 6 more of the students to start to really believe in themselves. I had a student this year, sorry to get off topic, who really started to see that she can do it, and she actually pulled out an A in Algebra 2, which was one of my small victories this year. As for my conclusions, Japan could learn how important socio-emotional well-being is of a student from the United States and Finland. In the United States and in Finland, we spend a lot of time actually talking to our students about socio-emotional well-being. We teach about it in class, we teach about self-care and things like that, where in Japan, the leading cause of death of students between the ages of 10 and 14 is suicide. They had 250 kids between the ages of 10 and 14 last year in Japan commit suicide and actually go through with it all the way. That's not just attempts, that's kids who actually did commit suicide. They had many more attempts. It's one of those things that's very not talked about. It's taboo in Japan, and it's really rough on the kids there to always be expected to do better and better and better, and then to outperform the kids around them so that they can get into the better lower secondary, upper secondary, and then into the best of the university so they can secure themselves a job. It's actually very sad, and it's something that I hope that Japan could take away from the United States and Finland. Finland could learn to do a better job of closing the gender gap both from the United States and Japan. Now, it might be kind of weird, but Finland actually has one of the largest reading gaps from any single one of the countries, and in math the girls are doing much, much better. They actually had like a 53 or 52 point difference from boys and girls on the PISA. Is actually the 4th largest gap on the PISA overall. In the United States and Japan, the gap was actually very close for boys and girls, surprisingly, although in the United States, they did have a large gap with socioeconomically disadvantaged versus non-socioeconomically disadvantaged. In Japan, they didn't have any of those gaps, which was a little strange for me. They are actually lower than the averages across the board. So that's one of the things that we can actually learn from Japan as well. The United States can learn how to close that socioeconomic divide from Japan. The United States, one of the last things is they can learn just how important a national curriculum is. In Japan, excuse me, and Finland, they have a national curriculum. We do too, but the thing is, states are able to exert their rights over national or over the curriculum within their state. And currently, only 45 out of 50 states are adopters of the Common Core State Standards for Mathematics. And one of the issues is the states who are non-adopters generally do poorly when it comes to testing. They generally do a fairly poor job when it comes to math assessment and math achievement. Outside of, I believe it's Michigan and Texas, they did adopt the Common Core State Standards, but they did not like the name of it. So what they did is they created their own set of standards and essentially took the Common Core State Standards and put their name on it for their state because they wouldn't be able to get it past the members of their state, supposedly. So that was my experience. I had a fairly good experience with this study. Every single time I did go off and start to read something, I found something else, and then I kept adding and adding and adding onto my paper, and it felt like I couldn't stop. So I'm sorry I had a 41-page paper. I really got into it and really enjoyed researching each of these countries. I hope you have a wonderful day, Dr. Dobson. Thank you.